So one helpful resource for teachers is a site by the University of Iowa that walks us through the various sounds of English. So let's have a look at this site, and this can give you some guidance on how the various sounds of English are pronounced.
Pa. Fa. Food. Lifeboat. Thief. E. 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 Eat. Week. Tree.
As we pronounce the various vowels and consonants of English, one thing to keep in mind is some activities that we can do as teachers. Some of the things we can do include modeling and showing pictures. We can also help students notice correct pronunciation. And then we can give them opportunities to hear the differences among minimal pairs in English. Now, minimal pairs are groups or pairs of words that are almost exactly the same except for one sound. And we have 4 examples here. We can see ban, van, copy, coffee, cat, caught, and cap, cab. Each of these words are almost the same except for one sound. So ban and van are almost the same except for the first sound. Copy and coffee are almost the same except for the medial sound or the middle sound. And cat, caught, almost the same except for the vowel sound. Cap, cab are almost the same except for the final sound. All of these words are examples of minimal pairs. And minimal pairs are quite helpful tools for focusing students and getting them to hear the difference in individual sounds of English. Now, as I mentioned, one way to help clarify the way sounds are pronounced in English is through modeling and through showing pictures. Now, I'll take a moment and show one way that I've found helpful for students to see how various sounds are pronounced in English is through the use of diagrams. And I find in my experience, the better diagrams, the more memorable diagrams, are the more somewhat outlandish. So I'll show an example of how I will show the difference for learners between the pronunciation of the L sound and the R sound. So I'll usually draw a character on the board, and the character might look something like this. And my character, as wild and as strange as this character looks, it makes it even more memorable for learners. So I have my teeth here, and I'll show my character. When I make an L sound, my tongue looks like this. And when I make an R sound, my tongue is curled back like this. So I have an L sound and an R sound. And when I show this character, the students are able to see the difference between the shape of the tongue in the mouth for an L sound and the shape of the tongue in the mouth for an R sound. And this really helps give them a nice clear visual image, quite memorable. And again, the stranger the character is, the more often enjoyable it is for the learners. But we want to use these kinds of visuals to demonstrate what's happening inside the mouth as sounds are being made. Now, another example of an activity that's helpful and enjoyable for pronunciation is what I call the telephone game. And this one, again, is pretty simple to play. And I'll demonstrate it as I did with my picture. And so when we look at this, we can see, if we pretend that this is the class board in the classroom, the whiteboard, I'll just write down the numbers. 5, and then on the other side, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0. Now, what I want to do here is I want to choose minimal pairs, and I want to write them on the board. So if I think, for example, of some sounds that learners struggle with, I know that they struggle with the F and P sound. So fan and pan. And this is an example of a minimal pair because the words are almost the same except for the first sound. Or maybe I can say ban and van, because some learners struggle with the V sound in English, the V sound. And I might say they and day. Now, if I want to throw in some vowels there, I could say the difference between E, or it, and eat. And some learners struggle with the difference between Luke and look. Okay, now that we have our example here, I'll go ahead and tell you my telephone number, and let's see if you can catch my number. So my phone number begins, this is my Canadian phone number, with day, pan, if, day, it, they, it, fan, ban. Now let's see if you could get my telephone number. So now that you've had a chance to listen to this, my phone number was 902-922-3215. Why don't you give that a try with your own students? So another activity idea that could be useful for learners is also shared with the phonics lesson, and this is bingo. Funphonics.com allows you to go in and choose a variety of short 3-letter, 1-syllable words, and many of these words are also examples of minimal pairs. Listening to these, listening and maybe writing these out after they've done the bingo game can be another example of an opportunity to practice listening and focusing on the individual sounds. Another idea is the use of chants. Now, this is an example of a phonics chant, but just as well, it can get students a chance to practice focusing on the individual sounds. In this case, we have bug, and the chant goes, B-U-N-G is bug, B-U-N-G is bug, U and bug is so put the in bug. And we can see through doing this chant that we're practicing stress and rhythm, while at the same time noticing the sound as it's made by you. Another activity idea is mechanical exercises. SAMI diagrams, as I explained before with my character showing the difference between L and R, can be very helpful. Drawing these kinds of visual diagrams can be memorable and can help students see where tongue and teeth is positioned in the mouth as they're trying to make these various sounds. Minimal pairs, as I mentioned, allows us to zone in, zero in, and focus on specific sounds, like the difference between the F sound and the P sound. And drills. Drills are good because they give learners the chance to practice speaking the sounds, but in a context. So a question and answer drill where I might say, how's the weather? It's sunny. How's the weather? It's rainy. This kind of drill back and forth between student and teacher gives students the opportunity to practice saying the sounds, but in the context of an actual sentence or an actual phrase. And context is equally important as practicing on the individual sounds. Drills can be a useful activity. So we'll go ahead and click, and I'll show you an example of a drill. Okay.
Judy, what's your name?
我求了 Judy. 这是你有名字 Judy.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
What's the weather like?
It's hot. It's hot. It's hot. It's hot.
What do you like to eat?
你想吃什么水果？
To
你
eat
想吃什么水果？什么水果？
apple. Good. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Peter, what's your name?
我求了
My name is Alan. What's your name?
Peter.
Good. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
What's the weather like?
It's hot.
Hot. Good. What do you like to eat?
I like to eat apple.
Good. What do you like to do? I like to fish. Go fishing. Okay. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Good. Carrie, what's your name?
Carrot.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
What's the weather like?
It's hot.
What do you like to eat?
I like to eat strawberry.
Good. What do you like to do? I like to.
Draw a picture.
Good. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Good. Anna, what's your name?
Anna.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
What's the weather like?
It's hot.
What do you like to eat?
I like to eat strawberry.
Good. What do you like to do? I like to.
这个
Jump.
这样
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Very good. Jenny, what's your name? How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
What's the weather like?
It's hot.
What do you like to eat?
I like to eat apple.
What do you like to do? What's your name?
Jerry.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
What's the weather like?
It's hot.
Good. What do you like to eat?
I like to eat pizza.
What do you like to do?
No.
Read a book. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Okay, very good.
So as we saw in the video, drills give students the opportunity to practice using the language in context, while at the same time modeling for each other correct pronunciation, intonation, stress, and so forth. Guiding students in that process, as we saw in the video, can be really helpful for giving them the chance to try out the new sounds, play with the new sounds in context. Now, another technique for teaching pronunciation that can be quite helpful is giving students the chance to read aloud. After they've had a chance to practice and they feel comfortable reading the passage, reading out loud gives them the chance to focus on articulating the sounds correctly without worrying too much about having to express their own meaning that they're just trying to create on the spot, without focusing on creating or thinking about what they want to say next. They can just focus on reading out loud and expressing themselves by saying the sounds as clearly and as well pronounced as possible. This is an activity that can be used for phonics, but it can also be used for listening and discriminating the various sounds of English and the vowel sounds as well. This is called jumping phonics. Now this is played with kind of a hopscotch grid that the teacher can have down on the ground. And on the hopscotch grid, you can have various vowel consonant combinations. So you'll have, for example, if you have the word day, you'll have AY written on the grid on the ground, and maybe at, an, ig, all these various consonant vowel combinations. Have them written on the grid, and then you can have various colored cards, take a marker and write a letter on each of these cards. Now, the students can get into two teams, and as they play this, you give the student a letter, and then they have to jump on the letters or the rest of the word that match that letter. So for example, if there's an og on the ground and you give them a D, they have to jump on the og. Or if there's an ig on the ground, if you give them W, they can jump on the ig, and so on and so forth. This gives them a chance to engage their whole bodies as they think about the initial sounds of the various words and what the rest of the syllable is and how they match those up. Another idea is also the fly swatter game. And the fly swatter game, we looked at an example for whole words when we looked at the phonics part. And in this case, you can just give students individual sounds. And as you pronounce the sounds, the students have to come up and they have to hit the board to identify the correct sound. So was it an F sound or was it a P sound? Was it a V sound or was it a B sound? Was it an E or an I? They have to be able to discriminate through the various sounds as they listen and then hit the correct sound on the board. Another activity idea is the board race. The board race is an example of an activity that gets students up, gets them moving around, and gets them thinking about the various sounds, how to pronounce the various sounds as they read the sounds on the word that are identified on the board. So we would have one student on one side of the board, another student on the other side of the board. They'll rock, paper, scissors. The winner gets to go first. They must read the word, pronounce the word correctly, and then the other student gets to go, and they go back and forth until they meet in the middle. When they meet in the middle, they have to rock, scissors, paper again. The winner gets to stay up and stay where they are, while the loser has to go back, and another team member takes their place at the beginning of their side. They go back and forth this way until one team gets to the other team's first spot on the board. And that's a board race. Again, lots of opportunity to read out loud and go back and forth, make sure that they pronounce the sounds correctly. So now we've looked at some activity ideas. Let's wrap up with some tips for how to teach pronunciation in English. The first thing to keep in mind is something we touched on a few times throughout this presentation, that we need to teach the sounds, the individual sounds, in isolation, and we need to teach them in context. So for example, when we use things like minimal pairs, as we did with the telephone game, that allows students to focus on the individual sounds in isolation. But when we do other activities like reading out loud or drills, this allows them to have an opportunity to practice the pronunciation, but putting the words into a context of a sentence. Now, as a teacher, it's important for us to model good pronunciation. And we can do this by speaking as naturally as possible, but slowing it down, speaking in chunks, giving students the opportunity to think before we proceed. Another idea is to have regular, short practice. Rather than trying to cram too much pronunciation practice into one class, it's best to spread it out over the entire course, and maybe 5 minutes a day, just to practice on an individual sound or to do a drill. Doing this spread out over time makes it less stressful, makes it more enjoyable, and makes it more memorable. It's also important to have a chance for students to do individual and choral work. Choral work allows them to model for each other pronunciation and to feel as part of the group and not feel singled out as they attempt to make these new sounds in English. However, individual practice gives you the opportunity as the teacher to hear where individual learners are. Where are they struggling? What sounds are they understanding? What sounds do they need more practice and more reinforcement with? And then finally, don't push too hard. In many of our own experience, we know that when it's pushed too hard on us to try and try, many times it just takes time for learners to develop into their own. I think of myself when I tried to learn the Spanish R. For months and months, I tried to learn it. I think any teacher I would have had would have been disappointed. But in one day, it just clicked for me. I heard it, I got it, I understood it. Now, any teacher that I might have had early on wouldn't have had the opportunity to see that happen. But the point is to give students a chance to practice, and realize that some of these things, some of these understandings might not come into place for them until later on. But we practice and we try not to push too hard. So I'll stop there, and I'd like to say thank you again for your time with me. My name's Dennis Murphy-Odo. Thank you very much.